Hey there folks, so welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And today we are finally going to be talking about the long-awaited comeback record, the self-titled album from Slowdive. Do you ever have the feeling like you might have gotten into certain genres the wrong way? Look, I know there's never any one right way to experience art or a specific genre. Most people rarely ever hit the clean entry points with more obscure or indie genres anyways, and it's always a little bit of a searching effort, but there is a part of me that feels like I've only ever approached shoegaze just completely wrong. Part of this is because I feel I jumped past a lot of the genre into atmospheric black metal and blackgaze, which meant that going back to some of these spacier, lighter tones just leave me feeling a little bit underwhelmed. Look, I get the appeal, believe me, but if I'm gonna listen to this sort of atmospheric, dreamlike music, I tend to prefer a little bit more muscle and backbone behind it. And from a lot of the shoegaze that I've heard thus far, I haven't really found a lot of it all that captivating to me. Even approaching it more from the ambient music perspective, it made a little bit more sense, sure, but my experience with ambient music has been more on the experimental electronic side, and thus a lot of the more conventional sounding shoegaze that came out in its heyday just didn't really grab my ear, coupled with much of it feeling very underwritten in the lyrics department. For the most part, I was comfortable saying that it wasn't bad music, it just wasn't for me. But at the same time, I didn't want to write off the entire genre without giving it a little bit more of a fair chance. So when the long-awaited self-titled comeback record from shoegaze dream pop group Slowdive showed up on my schedule, I did want to make an effort to eventually explore it, albeit a few months later when a lot of the pressure and hype had died down. So I took my time, I went through the back catalog, and look, I don't know what to tell you. It's very pleasant music, but it just didn't really stick with me, like with a lot of shoegaze. Some of the melodies on Souvlaki were really good. I found some of the ambient electronics on Pygmalion really kind of intriguing, but beyond that, not a lot of this really grabbed me, I'm sorry. But hey, it's been over 20 years since that last album. Maybe in the meantime, all the band's experiences and other groups would add up to this comeback project being pretty solid, right? Honestly, I'm not sure what to tell you here. If you expected Slowdive to innovate in a dramatic way with this self-titled album, or push their sound in a way that would reflect the years between projects, or do something that would invigorate or challenge an audience in the same way that Pygmalion did, or even just return to their roots effectively, yeah, I gotta be honest, I'm not really hearing that. And that's because this self-titled record might have some of the elements in the composition that call back more to their roots in shoegaze or dream pop, but much more of the sound reminds me of some particularly clean post-rock. Now, that's not saying that's precisely a bad thing. There's a lot of post-rock that I like. And the compositions and writing behind this album, it does help ease over some of the shift in sound, but I can't help but feel pretty distant towards this project overall, only further emphasized by a lot of the delivery in the vocals, the writing, and the production. And I'm not sure it's the best fit for a lot of these compositions or the underlying themes behind this album, for the extent that we got themes at least. It's not a bad release, let me stress this. I can see why some people have really gotten behind it, and why some fans who like this sort of sound have given this a lot of critical acclaim. But it's not exactly one that's sucking me in, or an album that's surprising me. And in terms of comeback records, I'm mostly lukewarm on it at best. It's good, not great. So let's start off with that shift in sound. And the most appropriate place comes in a lot of the production and the composition. For one, unlike previous Slowdive records, this album was entirely produced by the frontman Neil Halstead himself, with no involvement whatsoever from engineer Chris Hufford. And while you might have been listening to Mojave 3, you might have seen some of this coming, it still was a little bit jarring coming from previous albums to get to this. The guitars are much cleaner and sharper, the looped melodic progressions, they're sitting in a liquid swell of reverb and slightly harsher synth as the drum sit midway to the back just tap out a pretty steady, distant rhythm. Honestly, the percussion doesn't really surprise me much here. There are hints of distortion that sit around some of the guitars and the bass on songs like Stars Rowing, No Longer Making Time, and Go Get It. With the former along with Everybody Knows and Don't Know Why, they're easily being some of the most propulsive and energetic songs that Slowdive has ever written. And if you can get yourself into the right headspace, it's got some solid swell to it. But the overall tone of this production is a little bit harder to quantify. The guitar lines, they sink into a mix that can lead to some density, at least on the surface, but the elements within the mix feel increasingly disconnected. They don't quite mesh or blend well with each other. The chill, low gurgle of the synth not quite matching the sparse groove or percussion, and it doesn't quite transition well either, all leading to to feeling so hollow and distant and nowhere close to organic with each other. And again, that's not saying that there aren't potent melodies in the composition here. The liquid echo of the guitar against the more prominent bass group sounds great on Sugar for the Pill. Even if the oddly rounded tones post-chorus, they do feel a little bit odd and kind of off to me. It's a similar sort of vibe that I liked about No Longer Making Time. But even then, even at the song's most hypnotic or meditative moments, I still feel like more of the emotions at their core, there just isn't that sense of closeness or intimacy that we got on early records. Hell, the closing track, Falling Ashes, it's a carefully overdubbed and constructed piano ballad that I feel is supposed to feel contemplative and wistful, and yet it's just not clicking with me beyond just some faint appreciation. And the vocal delivery is certainly not helping. And here's the thing, if Slowdive were going to keep with more intimate production, this method of vocal delivery, I think it would have been fine. Soft, inviting, gentle, seeking to coax the audience into the mood and the intimate emotions and stories running through these albums. The problem is that when you have production that's more propulsive, carrying a little bit more of an edge and a much bigger mix with the synth and more energy in the guitar grooves, you would expect the vocals to pick up a little bit more presence or immediacy, and that really does not happen. Now don't get me wrong, I like Neil Halstead's lower tones especially, and Rachel Goswell's ethereal cooing, it sounds really beautiful at points, but if you're gonna kick up the grooves and production to feel so much bigger, you'd like to think there'd be a little bit more passion here, or at the very least layering that didn't feel like the words were getting lost in the swell and overdubs, which only further emphasized that detachment I have from the emotional dynamics. But okay, maybe that was the point if you go back to the lyrics, right? Well, that's kind of a tricky argument to say. I mean, you could say there's something that feels kind of clinical about some of the language on songs like Slomo, describing that curious love. It almost feels analytical, or how so much of this record uses the past tense and seems to be reflecting on past relationships that hit a moment of life before sparking out, moments of half-remembered passion on blissed out summer nights that cause you to step back and have these songs thinking more about love than feeling it. Hell, I even like how, unlike so many groups with multiple lead singers, Slowdive actually gets some mileage in the writing pairing Halstead and Goswell against each other, like on the frustrated post-breakup emotions of Don't Know Why. But then you have songs like Stars Roving and No Longer Making Time and Go Get It that are aiming for a sort of wistfulness that runs through more deeply and seems to demand some greater passion or emotional involvement in the writing, or at least production that would better isolate and focus on the performers. And I'm just not getting the urgency in the delivery to really suck me in. It doesn't help that, like with most shoegaze, the album feels kind of underwritten, broad platitudes to which you really only need a sense of swell and presence or even deeper intimacy to really pull you closer. As it is here, it just feels like fragments that are hanging in the air, disconnected ideas that don't really have enough power in their own right to rise above it all. Now look, I know, this is coming off as more negative than it probably should be. And as I said, maybe this type of shoegaze and dream pop just isn't for me. I can accept that. But at the same time, I also feel like Slowdive hits a weird half measure on this album that doesn't quite complement their strengths, trying to approach a specific vibe and atmosphere that I found that, say, the XX hit far more effectively this year, and I See You, that I found way more captivating and compelling, even though that record went bigger too. Look, if you're a Slowdive fan, I can see a lot of you really loving this. But again, I'm only kind of lukewarm and distant from this entire genre, really, which means I'm giving it a strong 6 out of 10 and really only a recommendation for fans only. Everybody else, check out the first 3 albums. They're arguably better. And if you're curious, might be worth a listen. Check it out. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. I'd like to like and subscribe. I'd be more than grateful. Yes, I know I'm late to the punch with this, but Patreon took its time getting the record up the schedule, and I did get to it, finally. But if you want to buy the record, links in the description below, and I got the poll up there. I'm curious where more shoegaze fans fall on this, especially considering this does pivot a little bit more to post-rock, so yeah, you guys can tell me how wrong I am in this regard. Beyond that, anything else I might be able to do to improve my presentation, I'm all ears. And if you guys want to get involved in my scheduling process so I can cover these sorts of albums earlier, link to my Patreon right there, where 3 times a week you guys get to vote on my schedule, and once a week you guys get to add records to my schedule, or even movies if you're in the higher tiers. More details right there, but until then, I'm Mark, you're watching Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.